think it's a great paper. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot from it. It was very provocative of my own thinking, in some ways critical, but I think that's the test of good scholarship, is whether it provokes critical thinking and reaction. I'm going to organize my comments in the form of like 3 questions, sort of 3 pointed questions that actually, make sort of an argument to a point. And the first one is sort of snotty sounding. And it's, who cares what John Marshall thought? And it's kind of like a challenge to whether or not what Marshall said or did is even relevant to assessing originalism as a method. And the second question will be, okay, assuming we do care what John Marshall thought, and I think we do, I mean, it's highly interesting, was John Marshall an originalist? If so, of what type? Was his interpretive method, did he really have one? Or was he, as Jeremy claims, completely eclectic and pluralistic? And I'm not sure I'm convinced by his thesis. So I'm going to propose an alternative hypothesis as to whether or not Marshall did have an implicit interpretive hierarchy, and sort of offer a preliminary defense of that. And then the third point is implicit in this article, and especially in the ipsa dixit label to it, is a potentially harsh criticism of Marshall or originalism, or a little bit of both, and that is the idea that it is infinitely manipulable, right? Core to Jeremy's thesis is that because there is no recognized hierarchy among interpretive modalities, the interpreter becomes free to choose, and the idea of separate interpretive methodologies reinforcing each other kind of gives way to what you might call an interpretive circular firing squad, where each argument sort of attacks the other. And he says that once you have that sort of system where the interpretive modalities point in different directions, there's essentially no constraint, and it all becomes ipsa dixit. So my third question will be, are there, in fact, principled second-order rules, correct second-order rules as to interpretive methodology that a good originalist should follow? And if so, what are they, and how far, if at all, did Marshall really strain from them? So I'll spend about 2 minutes each on each of these 3 questions. The first question is my lowering the stakes question of who cares what John Marshall thought? And even though that is a little bit irreverent, almost blasphemous, especially coming from someone who's a graduate of the John Marshall Elementary School in Wausau, Wisconsin, there's actually a serious point in this, in that I think that John Marshall doesn't have to be an originalist for originalism to be correct as a methodology, right? John Marshall's and even the Marshall Court's opinions, decisions, and methodologies don't themselves constitute direct evidence of the original meaning of the Constitution on the question of how the Constitution is properly to be interpreted, right? It's reasonably interesting early practice. It is evidence of early interpretive methodologies, but it's not itself direct evidence of the original meaning on the question of what are the proper methods for constitutional interpretation. So that efforts to enlist Marshall in support of originalism by originalists, if there are any, are to some extent misguided, or at least overdrawn or overstated, and that efforts to use Marshall's inconsistency to refute originalism are equally of limited probative value. So my core point is John Marshall doesn't have to be an originalist for originalism to be correct. More than that, the evidentiary question, one might even say that original meaning textualism is kind of a self-contained theory of interpretation that doesn't depend really on evidence that it was practiced, specifically even in the early practice. If the theory of interpretation of the Constitution is that because it is a written text, you are governed by the original meaning of the written text, it doesn't matter even if the early practice departed from that. So that's sort of a challenge to the project too. Secondly, and this really gets to the core of what Jeremy's excellent paper is really all about. Was John Marshall an originalist? And I think that's at least a highly interesting question, even if it doesn't determine the answer to whether originalism is correct as an interpretive methodology. We're all interested in John Marshall. Was he an originalist? Well, it depends on what you mean by originalist, and Jeremy makes that point. If you mean broadly, was he committed generally to approaches to interpretation of the text that privileged the original meaning of the words inferences that can properly be deduced from its structure and the logic of its operation and its nature, sort of a whole text textualism, and evidence of original subjective intention or historical purpose, I think you can say that, well, yes, generally, mostly, most of the time, except when he wasn't, John Marshall was an originalist, at least of a certain type. Certainly, there are some cases, there are exceptions. Sometimes his interpretive methodology misfires. Sometimes he might be using it a little bit mischievously. I mean, that's always the rap on John Marshall. But I think that good originalists will sometimes disagree as to how originalism plays out in particular instances. And I don't see Marshall as being that bad. Did he have an implicit hierarchy of interpretive sources? And I'm not sure of this. I'm not enough of a Marshall scholar to have a firm opinion. But it seems to me, at least from looking at his major opinions, that he was running a mostly consistent interpretive program. If you think of the modalities as text, structure, evidence of original intention or purpose or history, precedent or practice, and then low down on the list, policy or pragmatic considerations, Marshall seemed to start at the second point with structure. Okay, now this is a type of textualism. It is a defensible interpretive methodology of textualism that looks to the whole text, the logic of the text, the structure and relation. And I think you do see that as a consistent approach. That seems to be where he starts. He doesn't start with abstract texts and then read to see if the structure illuminates text. He looks to principles of structure and theory and first principles and then tries to read the texts in light of that evidence. I think that's an originalist method. You can debate whether that's the right priority. You can debate whether structural arguments are infinitely manipulative, but it is a fair method of textualism. He does invoke history and original intent, but generally, at least in my perception, not in ways that would contradict an otherwise clear meaning to the text. He will use evidence of intention and historical purpose, typically to buttress a textual outcome that he would reach independently on its own grounds. There may be some instances, but that's part of my challenge to Jeremy, is to show me where intention is used in preference to contradict the meaning of an otherwise relatively clear text. Sometimes it illuminates the text, but I don't. It's hard for me to come up with specific examples, and I didn't see them in Marbury and in McCulloch. Finally, he will cite precedent and practice, but my perception, at least, is that when Marshall invokes precedent or longstanding practice, he's using it to stack the deck rhetorically just a little bit, to sort of prejudge the issue and set up his other arguments, that the core arguments doing the work are the structural or logical principles and the textual principles, but the precedent one is something that is intuitively appealing. Less common, I think, are cases where he actually uses precedent or practice to contradict what he would otherwise conclude to be the original meaning of the text or the logic of its structure. So I asked myself the question, okay, as a good, pure originalist, what would convince me, what would be knockdown evidence that Marshall was a betrayer of the interpretive method of originalism? And so what I would be looking for is a major, significant constitutional decision or a pattern of decisions that reach outcomes that cannot plausibly be defended by a fair reading of the text of the Constitution, that are also insupportable by correct structural or logical first principles, and that contradict evidence of original intention or historical purpose. I think it's harder to find that, except for some of the preliminary holdings in Marbury versus Madison. But in the end, this leads me to is to being a little bit skeptical about the conclusion that it's all ipsa dixit. I think he is running an interpretive methodology. It is a contestable methodology, but it is in some level a principled methodology in the main. Okay, my third question is this. Like, implicit in all of this is the idea that if there is no hierarchy of the sources of interpretive methods, does that give way to the interpretive circular firing squad? Does the Constitution itself suggest rules of priority for interpretive methods? And I'd like to put that question to Jeremy as to what his interpretive program would be. I have one of my own. I have a few principles. I think the text should always trump specific intentions where they are in contradiction of each other. Historical evidence of its subjective intentions or expectations might help you inform the meaning of your understanding of the words that are used. But if the text clearly says one thing and there's specific historical evidence of intentions to reach a different result, I think that a proper originalist interpretive program would always privilege the text over the intention. Similarly, I think that a proper interpretive method will always privilege the text over precedents or practice that you can say demonstrably depart from the text. If the text of the Constitution as originally understood or in its original meaning of its words clearly says one thing, and precedent or practice clearly says something else, I think you have to go with the text every time. Similarly, though you can make this accusation that Marshall, when he uses structural or first principles arguments, is actually engaged in policy, I think that in principle the text should always prevail over policy arguments over what would be a better reading of the text. I don't see Marshall as departing from that, but that's my last challenge to Jeremy is, are these interpretive principles correct, and was Marshall a habitual violator of any one of them?
Jeremy, you want
So,
to pick up there?
yeah. So on the first question, does it matter whether Marshall was originalism? As I said in my introduction, in the big picture, no. There's plenty of ways to be an originalist, whether or not Marshall was an originalist. But then, right, we've got all of those big Marshallian precedents that we all sort of accept. I shouldn't say we all, that are generally accepted as good precedent. And if you're a strict originalist and you think Marshall was a non-originalist, well then, you know, you've got to work all that stuff out. I also think it matters for specific types of originalism, like Mike Rappaport's and John McGinnis's original methods originalism, if Marshall wasn't an originalist. Your second point is it depends on was Marshall an originalist? It depends on what we mean by originalism, and I agree. My argument is not that Marshall was not an originalist. My argument is that the debate between originalism and non-originalism is not a very good way to get at what was going on in the constitutional jurisprudence of the Marshall Court. I think you can pull out plenty of evidence if you're an originalist to support the claim that he was an originalist, but I also think you can find plenty of evidence if you're a living constitutionalist that he was a living constitutionalist, which means that the happiest person should be Jack Balkin, because it looks like he was both. You lay out a series of challenges which make me nervous. You know, can I find a place where Marshall would favor intention over the text? Of course not, because he always found that the intention was whatever he thought the text meant. And I don't mean that to disparage him. I regard that as a good faith effort of interpretation on his part. So then I think your last challenge was my interpretive hierarchy, I think. And again, I'm acting as a historian. Fortunately, I mean, nobody pays me for these things, right? So I haven't developed an interpretive hierarchy, but I think I like Marshall. I think his approach is in many ways exemplary. I like common law decision making, and I don't think, and I don't mean ipsa dixit to disparage what Marshall was engaged in. Still, I think that it doesn't lead to a circular, what is it, an interpretive circular firing squad?
Yeah.
I think there's still plenty of room for restraint. Restraint comes from all of the usual places. So the text is a constraint. Evidence of intention is a constraint. Evidence of purpose is a constraint. But none of them are dispositive. Precedent, logic, those are all constraints. But I think the most important restraint is that judges have to write written opinions, and they have to live with what they've written and potential scorn and ridicule if their opinion is sloppily reasoned.